Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010 Summer Session 2019. In this video we are going over the question for Exam 1, Part A, number 4. Which do you prefer, Plato's theory of the soul or Aristotle's? How do each of their theories relate to their respective theories about absolute forms or ideas? So in the previous video I compared Plato's Chariot Analogy in the Phaedrus to the Chariot Analogies in the Katha Upanishad and the questions to King Milinda. So we went over the theory of Plato's basic theory of the absolute ideas, and we will be going over them again. I'll go over the Phaedrus again a little bit, but I'll focus primarily on the dialogue, the Phaedo, on page 251 of our book, which is Introduction to World Philosophy, a multicultural reader. So on page 251, Plato's the Phaedo starts. So Plato wrote dialogues featuring his teacher Socrates, who had been executed in 399 BCE for corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods of the state. And this dialogue, the Phaedo, takes place in the prison cell on the day that Socrates is forced to drink hemlock, the poison that kills him in the end. So two of his young disciples, his students, Simmias and Cebes, are in there, and they're saying, Socrates, how come you're so jolly, despite the fact that you'll be dead by the end of the day? And he responds, he says, don't you think philosophers spend their whole lives preparing to die? And in what sense? That sounds like a funny thing to say. And he says, in the sense that they retreat as much as they can from the bodily sense desires. The soul, which is separate from the body, if you're a philosopher, you try to withdraw from the body as much as possible so that when you die, you don't have to come back to another body. And he explains the whole philosophy throughout the Phaedo. But we're going to focus just on his theory of the soul. So according to Socrates, death is merely the departure of the soul from the body. He says that on page 251 in the right-hand column. And is this anything but the separation of soul and body? And being dead is the attainment of this separation. So, and then he's saying, should a philosopher be so worried about that, since that's what they train to do their whole lives? On page 252, at the bottom of the left-hand column, Socrates says, and thought is best when the mind is gathered into herself, and none of these things trouble her, neither sounds nor sights, nor pain, nor any pleasure, when she has as little as possible to do with the body, and has no bodily sense or feeling, but is aspiring after being. And she desires to be alone and by herself. That's true. Well, but there's another thing, Simmias. So he's talking to Simmias. Is there or is there not an absolute justice? Assuredly there is. And an absolute beauty and absolute good? Of course. But did you ever behold any of them with your eyes? Certainly not. Or did you ever reach them with any other bodily sense? And I speak not of these alone, but of absolute greatness and health and strength, and of the essence or true nature of everything. Have you ever perceived the reality of them through your bodily organs, or rather, isn't the nearest approach to the knowledge of their several natures made by one who so orders his intellectual vision as to have the most exact conception of the essence of that which he considers? So he's saying to have knowledge, true knowledge of the eternal unchanging forms of things, the absolute ideas, you cannot depend on your bodily sense perceptions. That was the empiricist perspective that the materialist Indian philosophy, the Charvaka philosophy, said that all knowledge must come from your sense perceptions. And also the Chinese Buddhist text that we read was focusing on that philosophy. Here, Socrates is completely rejecting that. He's saying, if you have any knowledge tainted with bodily sense perception, it will be impure and not worthy of taking seriously. So he's the anti-empiricist, another word for which is the idealist. He believes in these absolute ideas that are recorded on every soul. Absolute beauty, absolute justice. So as I described in the previous video, Socrates would ask, there's many different beautiful people. What is it about them? What is the one common element of beauty that enables us to designate all of these different material examples of beauty? What is the eternal form of beauty in which all beautiful creatures participate? And he's saying your sense perceptions can only hinder the search for these absolute forms of knowledge. It's better to let the soul withdraw from the senses inward as much as possible, which is a kind of a death to the world. You have to die to the world in order to perceive the spiritual world. That is what Socrates is saying. And remember, he's in a jail and he's preparing to drink poison and die. And he's saying the body is like a jail. The whole material universe is like a jail from which we should strive as much as possible to free ourselves. So going back on page 252, so he's saying absolute beauty and the absolute good, these things can only be seen when you purify yourself of all bodily sense perceptions and bodily desires. And to try to move this along, since we have so many other readings to go through, if you look on page 254, in the middle paragraph, on the left-hand column, he says, then now let's return to the previous discussion. Is that idea or essence, which in the dialectical process we define as the essence of true existence, whether essence of equality, beauty, or anything else, are these essences, I say, liable at times to some degree of change? Or are they each of them always what they are, having the same simple, self-existent, and unchanging forms, and not admitting any variation at all, or in any way, or at any time? So they're unchanging, and they're uncomposite. The idea of beauty is one simple thing. It's not composed of different parts. It's an absolute single essence of beauty. It's the absolute perfect idea of what all beautiful things participate in, and it's unchanging. It's eternally the same. So this is he's trying to give evidence for why we should believe the soul is eternal. And this is called the evidence by analogy. So the absolute ideas that they're talking about, the idea of justice and beauty and goodness, are simple, meaning uncompounded. They're not composed of parts, and they're eternal and unchanging. And they're invisible. They can only be apprehended by the mind. And is the soul like them, or is the soul like the ever-changing invisible body? Well, you can't see it. So right there, that says it's like these absolute ideas. And so the conclusion is the soul, like the absolute ideas that it strives to perceive, is simple and eternal, not composed of parts. And that the more the soul tries to purify herself by withdrawing from all sense perceptions and trying to perceive the absolute eternal ideas implanted within each soul, then the greater the chances are of escaping the cycle of reincarnation and returning to a communion with God. That's what Socrates says he hopes. If you look on page 255 of the right-hand column, he says, and are we to suppose that the soul, which is invisible, in passing to the true Hades, that's the afterworld, which like her is invisible and pure and noble, and on her way to the good and wise God, to which, if God wills, my soul is also soon to go, that the soul, I repeat, if this is her nature and origin, is blown away and perishes immediately on quitting the body, as the many say? That can never be, dear Simmias and Cebes. The truth rather is that the soul that is pure at departing draws after her no bodily taint, having never voluntarily had connection with the body, which she is ever avoiding herself. So that's why philosophy is preparing to die, whereas those who are always addicted to bodily sense gratifications, you can see them sometimes, he says on page 256 on the left-hand column, as ghosts. When they die, their souls are not allowed to ascend because the the leaden weight of bodily desire drags them down, and so they're prowling around tombs and sepulchres as ghostly apparitions. And then he talks about reincarnation. If you're a kind of a person who acts like, is addicted to gluttony and wantonness and drunkenness, then you'll pass into the animals such as asses and other kinds of animals of that sort. Tyrants might pass into wolves or hawks. Very industrious, civically virtuous people who are only virtuous out of fear of being exposed for being unvirtuous come back as very civic-minded animals like bees or ants, he says. But a real philosopher who acts justly because of the knowledge of absolute justice, that person comes back, if at all, as a human being and as a philosopher, and the hope is to never come back at all and never be reborn and return to the eternal spiritual world. So the Phaedrus, we went over in the previous video, it's focusing on the chariot analogy. So after you die, your soul is carried by a chariot, which is similar to the subtle material or the mental body. It's a physical thing, but it's subtler than the gross physical body. And this chariot has two horses pulling it. And the one is ignoble and the other is noble. And I mentioned in the previous video, it's similar to the theory of the three modes of nature from the Hindu philosophy. Goodness, passion, and ignorance are sattva guna, rajaguna, and tamaguna. So the charioteer is kind of like sattva guna, the intellect, and then the two horses are like passion and ignorance. And the ignorant, tamaguna, the bodily desires and appetites, pulls the chariot of your mind not towards the outermost horizon of the universe where you can perceive the absolute forms of justice and beauty, but down to the lower spheres, to the earthly matter. So to get more detail, just refer back to that previous video comparing the chariot analogies from the Katha Upanishad and the Buddhist chariot analogy and the Phaedrus. But I think it's important that it's on this outside of heaven. If you look on page 257, the demigods go and they stand on the outer vault of heaven and they perceive absolute justice and absolute beauty. So it says, but when they go to banquet and festival, then they move up the steep to the top of the vault of heaven. The chariots of the gods in even poise, obeying the rein, glide rapidly. So it's where they... So I'm just going to skip a little bit here. So the revolution of the spheres carries them around, and they behold the things beyond. But of the heaven, which is above the heavens, who can describe that? He says, well, I'll try. There abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned. All of the absolute essences exist in this heaven of heaven, the outermost sphere. And if you can perceive them, that ensures that you'll have, at the very least, a good rebirth. If you look on page 258 at the right-hand column up at the top, the soul that has seen the most of truth shall be born as a philosopher, or artist, or some musical and loving nature. The second degree will be a righteous king or a warrior chief, and he goes down the bottommost. The person who's seen the least amount of truth, or has seen the outermost sphere the least, where the absolute ideas are contained, becomes a tyrant. So if you look at the bottom of the right-hand column on page 258, but the soul which has never seen the truth will not pass into the human form, for a man must have intelligence of universals, those are the absolute essences of things, and be able to proceed from the many particulars of sense to one conception of reason. In the previous video I talked about it. According to Plato, so there's many pens. I've got a blue pen here, I've got a black pen here, I've got another pen over here. What is it about each of these that makes them a pen? They all participate in the absolute idea, the perfect essence of what a pen is. All of those absolute ideas are contained in the outermost sphere of the universe, which is like the mind of God. And each soul strives to reunite with that outermost sphere, to perceive these absolute forms, not only of concrete things like pens and trees, but also of the abstract concepts like justice and beauty. They're all to be perceived out at the outermost sphere of the universe, in between births. Now, I'm going to take a break before I move on to Aristotle, who has a whole different idea of the absolute ideas. Well, not entirely different, but they're not transcendent of the universe. But this near-death experience described in the Phaedrus, also in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, at the very end, the myth of it's very similar to holographic string theory, which I've mentioned before. I'll mention again, just because current academic cosmology, which was originated by Plato in the original academy in Greece, just north of Athens, in an olive grove called Academia, it has culminated in these past 24 centuries with holographic string theory, which says that the past, the present, and the future of all of space and time are interwoven at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where, from our perspective on Earth, it seems that space and time are expanding away at the speed of light. Superimposed, all of the history and future of the universe is at every point there, and it radiates in on these fundamental threads to create these holographic objects of three-dimensional objects enduring through linear time, rolling forward at a constant rate. That's the illusion that we live in, projected from the horizon of the cosmos. That's string theory. Leonard Susskind is an atheist. He's against all kinds of ideas of cosmic intelligence, and yet you see how very similar his mathematical cosmology is to the cosmology that Plato had in mind when he began the entire academic enterprise of mathematical cosmology. And it's also very similar to two near-death experiences, to many others as well, but two in particular. One is Carl Jung, as described in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I'll just read a little bit here. After he came back into his body, when his soul rose above his body during a near-death experience, he said, "Disappointed, I thought, now I must return to the box system again, for it seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up, in which each person sat by himself in a little box. I had been so glad to shed it all, but now I would again be hung up in a box by a thread." That's the main point. So his idea, and then later in that recollection, he says, "It seemed to me as if the past, present, and future were interwoven at the horizon of the cosmos. Each of us here in three-dimensional space is as if we live in a little box tethered to the horizon by a thread." That is exactly what Leonard Susskind says. And then the other near-death experience, which is very similar to what Plato's describing in the Phaedrus, is by Eben Alexander, the Harvard neurosurgeon. And so he says in his book, what is the name of his book again? Proof of Heaven, a Neurosurgeon's Near-Death Experience and Journey into the Afterlife. I'll just read one excerpt from his book. He says, "Just as my awareness was both individual and yet at the same time completely unified with the universe, so also did the boundaries of what I experienced as myself at times contract and at other times expand to include all that exists throughout eternity. The blurring of the boundary between my awareness and the realm around me went so far at times that I became the entire universe." So that's a near-death experience, and Plato is here writing about a near-death experience, as he does also in The Republic, which makes me take it more seriously. Those parallels between these ancient near-death experience accounts from Plato and the Upanishads, the modern the totally recent near-death experiences of Carl Jung, Eben Alexander, and others, and then holographic string theory. They're so similar that it makes me pause and say, is that just a coincidence? I doubt it could be just a coincidence. But now we move on to somebody who also had a philosophy of God existing at the outermost sphere of the universe, and that's Aristotle. But that was really the only absolute idea that he said is transcendental, that transcends the universe, is this absolute ultimate form of God. The other forms are absolute essences of things. For Aristotle, they don't exist in the outermost sphere, divorced from matter. They only exist combined with matter. That they can only express themselves when they transform potential, or they transform matter into the form that that essence brings them into. So again, I know this is an introductory class, and these are very nuanced and complicated topic, so I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I can. Also for the fact that I've studied Plato a lot more seriously than Aristotle, because I just agree with Plato more, so I'm not as aware of all the details of Aristotle's philosophy, so I'll just try to keep it as simple as I can. So on page 260 of our book, Aristotle from De Anima. So what is the soul? And he starts by saying, let's dismiss what everyone else said, mainly his teacher, Plato. So Aristotle studied with Plato for 20 years. And then he went and became the tutor of Alexander the Great. So that's a big piece of history. And this is Aristotle's philosophy of what a self is. So page 260, he says, let the foregoing suffice as our account of the views concerning the soul which have been handed on by our predecessors. Let us now dismiss them and make, as it were, a completely fresh start, endeavoring to give a precise answer to the question, what is a soul? i.e. to formulate the most general possible definition of it. So then he starts to define the terms he'll need in order to assemble a definition of a soul. One of them is matter, and the other is form, and then he talks about the combination of both. So, and he describes life as self-nutrition and growth. What's the difference between, there's a lot of different types of material bodies, and some are alive and some aren't. What's the difference between the living and the non-living material bodies? The living ones have a soul. But what is the soul? It's not what it is for Plato and for the Hindus. It's not an infinitesimal point that reincarnates from one body to the next and strives to return to the eternal horizon of the cosmos where all the absolute ideas of God reside. For Plato, for Aristotle, he does believe in a God, and he does even put God out at the outermost sphere of the universe, although he doesn't mention that in this excerpt that we read. But he's saying the only part of the soul that might be eternal is the mind, and he breaks different types of souls into the type of a soul that enables plants to gather nutrition, then the type of a soul that enables animals to have sensations, beginning with touch. Some animals have all five senses, all five, some only have one. So he gets into a lot of nuanced details, which is, a lot of people praise Aristotle for that. They're saying he took Plato's philosophy and brought in a whole nother level of detail to help us nail down even more precisely what it is we mean when we use our words. But for this, for the purposes of exam 1, I'm going to go back and read this question. The question is part A, question 4, which do you prefer, Plato's theory of the soul or Aristotle's? How do each of their theories relate to their respective theories about absolute forms or ideas? Okay, so for Aristotle here, I'm going to read now on page 260. He's saying, on the right-hand column, a little down from the top, he says, but substance is actuality, and the soul is the actuality of a body, as above characterized. Now, the word actuality has two senses corresponding respectively to the possession of knowledge and the actual exercise of knowledge. The next paragraph down, he says, that is why the soul is the first grade of actuality of a natural body, having life potentially in it. Now I know this is getting confusing, but I'm just going to keep reading through to get a taste, and then I'll summarize the whole thing. On page 261, in the left-hand column, up near the top. If then we have to give a general formula applicable to all kinds of soul, we must describe it as the first grade of actuality of a natural organized body. That doesn't make so much sense, but what he goes on to say will help to illuminate that. He says, that is why we can wholly dismiss as unnecessary the question whether the soul and the body are one. It is as meaningless as to ask whether the wax and the shape given to it by the stamp are one, or generally the matter of a thing and that of which it is the matter. Okay, so here's what he's trying to say. The soul gives form to matter. The absolute ideas, and the soul he's correlating the soul with these absolute forms. Now, to what degree are they identical with Plato's absolute essences and the soul? For Plato, the soul is different than the absolute ideas in some respect, although you could also say the soul is made of all of the absolute ideas, which culminate in the idea of the good. So the soul is kind of a spark from the original light, the idea of the good. For Aristotle, he's just saying, if you see, for example, a dog, then it was the soul of the dog that gave it form. So the soul of a dog, or the idea, the essence of a dog, is there. And then matter comes along and they combine, and the matter tries to achieve the perfect form that's contained in the idea of a hog, or a dog in this case, or whatever species it is, and the matter can never fully actualize the pure form. It achieves the highest approximation that it can, and then it decays. But the form remains unchanging, but it's immanent in matter all the time. Sometimes it's drawing matter into the form of whatever species it is, and then that matter will fade away. So he doesn't talk about reincarnating souls. The soul is there, it gives form to a body, and then the body dies. Now the form or the soul may be eternal, but it's not your individual soul and my individual soul with all our memories. There just seems to be this essence of a human soul that draws matter into human forms periodically and then fades away. So, and he admits he just doesn't know everything about what's going on. If you look on the right-hand column on page 261, he says in the middle, from this it indubitably follows that the soul is inseparable from its body, or at any rate, that certain parts of it are, if it has parts, for the actuality of some of them is nothing but the actualities of their bodily parts. Yet some may be separable because they are not the actualities of any body at all. Further, we have no light on the problem whether the soul may not be the actuality of its body in the sense in which the sailor is the actuality of the ship. So he's saying, I'm not sure exactly about an eternal soul that exists after the body dies. There might be some element of a soul, the rational part, that is eternal, because that part of the soul doesn't correlate to any material body at all. The nutritional aspect of the soul applies to plants and animals. The sense perception aspect of the soul applies to animals and to humans. So it gets complex, and but the main thing I think we want to keep in mind for comparing Aristotle to Plato for this introductory class, and I think that's a good quote to use on page 261 on the right-hand column. From this, it indubitably follows that the soul is inseparable from its body. So for Plato, the soul is totally separate from the body. It's imprisoned in the body. You want to separate it from the body as much as possible while you're alive, so that when you do die, your soul isn't habituated to return into another material body, and you can fly out with the chariot of your mind to the outermost horizon of the universe. Aristotle doesn't see it that way, although he does leave open the possibility that there's some eternal element of the soul, which is reason, and he does believe in a God, which is not mentioned in this dialogue here. So I think for our purposes that's enough from Aristotle. It's much shorter than the Platonic readings, so the main point here is Aristotle does not believe in reincarnation like Plato. He doesn't talk in this article, De Anima, about the outermost horizon where God exists, although he does mention God, but God isn't interested in us like God seems to be in Plato's dialogues. And for Plato, the absolute ideas exist whether there's matter or not. They don't depend on the material world for their existence. They draw matter into the imperfect copies of itself, but they remain inviolable and perfect and unchanging. For Aristotle, the absolute forms don't change, but they depend on matter to exist, to manifest themselves. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll continue in the next video about René Descartes' concept of the self.